Look at this. Don't murder, which means don't deprive your neighbor of his life. And we'll talk about the difference between murder and killing. Okay? The commandment is don't murder. It's not don't kill. Pacifism is not supported by the Ten Commandments. Pacifism is not supported by the Bible in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Okay? God calls upon his people to defend themselves, to defend their families, okay? To defend their nations, to defend those who are under their charge. So pacifism is not here, all right? Anti-capital punishment folks like to go to the sixth commandment and you shall not murder. And listen, before this commandment is even given, back in Genesis chapter 9, you take a person's life, your life will be taken, right? This is back in Genesis because of the dignity inherent in human beings. People forfeit their very lives by killing human beings. So don't deprive your neighbor illegitimately of his life. Secondly, adultery. Don't deprive your neighbor of his family. Thirdly, theft. Don't deprive your neighbor of his goods. Fourthly, false witnesses. Don't deprive your neighbor of his reputation. And then fifthly, coveting. Don't despise what God has given you. I would argue that the second table really almost goes backwards. Like the first commandment becomes this umbrella over the first table of the law and explains the first table of the law, I would say that the 10th commandment becomes an umbrella and explains the second table of the law. And so you have this sort of increasing severity. Let's look at it backwards. You have the 10th commandment, don't covet. And ultimately, coveting is about you not being satisfied with what God gave you, and instead wanting what he gave you plus what he gave your neighbor. Okay? Be satisfied with what God has given you. Then it becomes more intense and more personal. Protect your neighbor's reputation. Then don't deprive your neighbor of his goods. Don't deprive him of his reputation. Next, don't deprive him of his goods. Thirdly, don't deprive him of his family. Because ultimately, this is what adultery is doing. It's depriving him of his family. And then, don't deprive him of his life. Do you see how there's sort of increasing degrees there? Coming from the 10th commandment and going backwards. So ultimately, what God is doing here in the second table of the law is he's talking about our duty horizontally to our fellow man, and he goes from the most severe down to the root cause. Don't deprive him of his life. If you'll deprive him of his life, it'll be easy for you to deprive him of his family. If you'll deprive him of his family, it'll be easy for you to deprive him of his goods. If you're willing to deprive him of his goods, it's easy for you to deprive him of his reputation. And ultimately, you're willing to do all of that because you're not satisfied with what you have, and instead you want what your neighbor has. See the connection? This is absolutely a whole. Especially when you understand that you not being satisfied with what you have is ultimately you not being satisfied with God, which takes us right back to the first table of the law.